Hey, welcome back. So, we've spent some time talking about musical notes and melody. So, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that even infants are capable of detecting melodies. Your book talks about the fact that 8-month-olds can actually recognize and learn new melodies, even if they've had a very short exposure, only about 3 minutes to a melody. Additionally, Safran and colleagues in 2000 actually reported that after being exposed to about 2 weeks worth of different Mozart sonatas, 7-month-olds could actually distinguish different melodies from each other. So this is something that comes very quickly to us in life, provided that there's sufficient exposure, of course. So, one of the other aspects of music that is especially important beyond the rhythm or beyond the melody is the rhythm. Music has a rhythm to it, but what's kind of interesting is that many sounds have rhythm. And oftentimes, what we'll actually find is we will often infer a rhythm for sequences that are not musical or not rhythmic. So, even tapping. Some of you are probably hearing a rhythm to it even now, or I can make one with a rhythm. When you hear trains going across the tracks, people report that trains tend to have a bit of a rhythm. And there's been very early perceptual research that has actually confirmed the idea that we tend to place a rhythm on sounds that do not seem rhythmic on the face of it. Bolton back in 1894 presented different participants with sounds that had no rhythm. These taps were presented at a pretty constant rate, but people still perceived that this tapping had a rhythm all its own, and they would often tend to group them in twos or threes. And typically, what Bolton and others have found is that when we infer a rhythm, what we typically tend to do is stress or accent the first sound of a group and then unaccent the rest. So, for example, when a train goes on the tracks and you can hear that rolling sound while you're waiting for the train to go by, you might hear da-dum, 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 da-dum. So that's a case where we get that kind of a rhythm. It's almost as if we infer an iambic pentameter, despite the fact that sounds don't really have like a pentameter to them. But it's almost like we have that iambic presentation of stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed. So this is kind of interesting. One of the ways that we can play around with rhythm, this is especially true if you're doing things like jazz or things like rhythm and blues, you can introduce a syncopation. So a syncopation typically is when we creatively try to deviate from that rhythm. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about our perception of a syncopation is that we have what are known as syncopated polyrhythms. So if I have two different rhythms, like the ones that are shown here, and you play them simultaneously, but what's really interesting is that these rhythms are out of sync. One of them is going to dominate. And our perception is that the subordinate rhythm will shift to fit the dominant one. So imagine, like you see in this figure, that I present you with one rhythm that goes da da da, da da da, da da da, da da da. And this rhythm goes da 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 da, da 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 da, da 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 da, da 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 da. Now, if we play these together at the same time, they're going to be out of sync. Usually one of these will become dominant. In this case, let's assume that that first rhythm that occurs in threes dominates. What you'll tend to find is that really the notes don't match up again. Like the stressed sounds only match up at certain points. You can see here, they really only match up every 12 notes. But what's interesting is that the major stressed portions of the subordinate rhythm will tend to move around and shift a little bit. We have the perception that it's shifting so that they can fit the dominant rhythm. It's almost like time compression is happening to make this. To make them match up when they don't. So now we're going to move on and talk about speech perception. So we're going to start by talking about the anatomy of the vocal tract and how speech is produced. So human beings are capable of producing a wide variety of speech sounds. About 5,000 languages are spoken around the world today. They utilize over 850 different speech sounds. Here in American English, we have about 26 letters, and we utilize about 43 different phonemes. So phonemes are kind of speech sounds that we make. So our language basically makes allowances for about 43 different speech sounds. So it's going to vary from language to language. So to understand how speech is actually produced and how sound goes from so basically how sound comes out of your mouth, we have to have a little bit of an understanding of the vocal tract. So the vocal tract is basically the airway above the larynx, which is right here, the airway above the larynx that is used for the production of speech. And this is going to include an oral tract, and it's going to include a nasal tract. And what's especially important about the vocal tract is that it stays flexible. The flexibility is critical because to be able to produce different sounds, you temporarily have to change the size and the shape of your vocal tract. So your vocal tract needs to be flexible to be able to do this. Now, to be able to produce any kind of sound at all, as we're going to see, you do actually need lungs and you need to breathe. So one of the things that you may not know, while I was on spring break, I actually had a little bit of a chest cold. At least I'm pretty sure it was a chest cold. I'm hoping it was a chest cold. But I had a cough. Not a super bad cough, but I did have a cough. And I could tell that I was not at my best because when I started recording lectures, because I was still focusing on my lungs healing, I was out of breath. There were times where I would have to pause the lecture just to take a quick breath. Don't worry, I'm okay now, but it was a little weird, and that's because air is really critical for producing sound. So what we're going to see is that sound travels through, we have to push air through our lungs, and basically when we push and aspirate that air, that is going to create vibrations in the larynx and the vocal folds. The vocal folds are located just above the larynx. They vibrate when air moves past them, and that's what allows sound to actually be heard. If you're having difficulty with your vocal folds, if you have nodes, like in Pitch Perfect, or if you have polyps and you require surgery, that's going to affect the quality and the sound of your voice. Now, once we get above the vocal folds, we have our vocal tract. So we have our oral tract, which is made up of our pharynx back here, our epiglottis, our tongue, which is going to be really critical, and our soft palate, our velum. That eventually becomes a hard palate up here. We have our teeth and our lips, and those are going to be really critical for forming sound as well. And then we have our nasal tract. Our nasal tract is up above. Some of our sounds are very nasal, some of them are not. And one other area that I will mention is the alveolar ridge. The alveolar ridge you should be able to feel at the roof of your mouth. It's a little ridge that's just before your teeth. So what we're going to find is that sounds are produced by the tongue making contact or closing off different parts of the oral tract. And then also with the shape of our mouth, we can modify the nasal tract to produce different types of sounds. So we'll talk about that more soon. So speech production involves 3 different steps. So we have respiration, which involves the lungs. You need to be able to breathe to produce sound. Phonation, where that air starts to vibrate off of the vocal cords. And then we have articulation, where we change the shape of the vocal tract to produce different types of speech sounds. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So you need air to produce speech. It kind of goes without saying. So to be able to initiate speech, the first major step that happens is your diaphragm, which is located right here just below the lungs, will help push air out of the lungs through the trachea up to the larynx. And then the next major step will be phonation. Phonation is the process through which the vocal folds start to vibrate as air pushes out of the lungs. For sound to be able to be produced, you have to either have some sort of vibration or some sort of molecular collision. So this vibrating that happens with the vocal folds is how speech is able to actually be in the form of a sound that people can actually hear. So generally, phonation is when air basically is being pushed through the larynx. It causes the vocal folds to vibrate. And generally, the larger the vocal folds are, the lower the voice pitch. So generally, we will tend to find that children and smaller adults tend to have smaller vocal folds. They can produce high-pitched voices. With adult men, they tend to have a larger mass of vocal folds and they produce lower pitched voices. And there are a lot of different things that you can do with your vocal folds to change the quality of that sound a little bit. So one of the things that we find, for example, that women are more likely to do than they used to is they will potentially produce what is called a creaky voice. Now, this is something that is certainly not necessarily only something we see with women. Ira Glass famously has a creaky voice, but a creaky voice is basically when you are trying to lower the register of your voice to the point where it produces a creak, especially at the end of sentences. And so here's kind of an example. So, okay, so I'm trying to talk like this right now. I'm trying to keep my voice low, and you can occasionally hear some of the creaks. If you want to see a really good example of creaky voice, I guess I've been told that Kim Kardashian has a really good example of creaky voice. And it's been suggested that part of the reason that creaky voice exists is because, well, it's a trend in language. And one of the things that we know, for women at least, it's a little harder to be taken seriously if your voice is higher pitched. And so by lowering your voice into registers that make them creak, you get taken more seriously. But apparently even that is not good enough. So you can actually lower your register, but it might create a little bit of a creak. Be prepared for that. Okay, so we've talked about respiration, we've talked about phonation, and now we're finally going to talk about articulation. So this is when the vocal tract can shape itself and move to basically produce speech sounds. So we're talking about areas above the larynx. So you can basically change the shape of your vocal tract by manipulating your jaw, your lips, the body of your tongue, the tip of your tongue, and the velum. Basically your soft palate. Your hard palate, you can't really do much with. That's why it's called a hard palate. But you can actually manipulate the shape of your soft palate. And because of that, you can change the quality of the sound by changing the size and the shape of the vocal tract. And that affects the frequency. So, for example, let me see if I can make my voice maybe a little bit more nasal. Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. I'm basically trying to create a more nasal sound by kind of closing off the back regions of my mouth so that I can utilize my nasal tract a little more. I also kind of scaled up the pitch. If I want to be less nasal, I'm going to keep my mouth a little more open. I'm going to kind of open up my vocal tract so it's like I have an egg in my mouth. So I'm speaking a bit more openly. I'm not really sounding as nasally as I can. So play around with your mouth. It is a very, very interesting tool to shape and change the shape up to see how sound quality changes. And this will also affect the frequency of the sound. So keeping a more open mouth can also lower the frequency. It might make you veer into creaky voice a little bit. but that's because you're largely hitting those lower sound registers. So vibration from the vocal folds, like we see with musical instruments and with other complex sounds, actually produces a harmonic spectra. So when I'm producing sounds and they are vibrating against the vocal folds, we get this nice harmonic spectrum. You can basically think of changing the shape of your vocal tract as basically creating a filter. And so let's kind of say, for example, that we have this particular filter function that's caused by the shape of our vocal tract. When we combine the harmonic spectrum produced by voicing sounds at the vocal folds, and we introduce that filter by changing the shape of our mouth, we produce output that looks like this. And so what you're going to see is that now the harmonic spectra is basically in the shape of that filter function, but we still have that harmonic spectra and that frequency. So what you can kind of see here is that we still have our harmonic spectra, but rather than the peak being at the very fundamental frequency, the peak is at the center portion of that part of the waveform. So here we have these three different peaks. And based on what we know about the harmonic spectrum, the frequency will decrease with each harmonic. But you can kind of see we've got these little peaks. These are what are known as formants. And formants are basically specified by their frequency. And generally the first formant is going to be the largest one. And then any additional formant that you have will be a little bit smaller in that frequency. So if we have vowel output such as ah or oh or E, it's going to produce a formant that kind of looks like this. So speech sounds change very, very rapidly over time. So when we map different types of speech sounds, how we tend to map it is with frequency on our y-axis and time over our x-axis. So what you're looking at here is what is called a spectrogram. So here we are mapping the spectra of the sound's frequency over time to see these different speech sounds. So here we are saying we were away a year ago. Now notice that some of these sounds tend to be notice that we have different peaks, we have different frequencies. That O sound, for example, is right here. It's O, it's very, very long. G tends to be a little bit shorter. So vowel sounds tend to be a little bit more open, especially if they're those long sounds like O, A, I. They tend to be a little bit longer than consonant sounds do, depending on the particular consonant. So speech sounds change rapidly over time. And what I really want to impress upon you is that if you didn't know this sentence were here, this would just look like a very, very long string of sounds. And really, that's what speech is. At least in cognitive psychology, one of the things that we're always interested in is something called the segmentation problem. How are we actually segmenting this long continuous string of sound into separate words? We're not really going to talk about the segmentation problem so much here, but I really want to impress upon you that if you don't have top-down knowledge of your native language, you're going to perceive speech as being a long, continuous string of noise, because it basically is. So speech sounds are often classified in terms of where we articulate them. So how we are using our vocal tract to produce the sound. So we're going to talk about a few different ways that we can kind of classify these. We can classify them in terms of where they tend to be articulated. So are they articulated at the lips? Is there a lot of lip motion for this sound? Do you have to, is the sound hitting the alveolar ridge? Does the tongue have to touch the alveolar ridge? Is the tongue touching the teeth? Is the tongue touching the velum, the soft palate? We'll talk about the manner of articulation. Are we completely blocking airflow, so total obstruction? Are we partially obstructing airflow, or are we slightly obstructing airflow. And then also voicing. Whenever you produce a particular speech sound, it is either going to be voiced or unvoiced. One of the ways that you can check this is you can put your hand up to your vocal folds. You can actually see if your vocal folds are vibrating. So for some speech sounds, they are what we call voiced. That means the vocal folds vibrate and you can feel them. Other ones are unvoiced and the vocal folds do not vibrate. So we'll talk about this more soon. I'm going to go ahead and stop here and we'll start talking about these different speech sounds next time.